Ideas and Interests by Ludwig von Mises. This article is excerpted from Theory and History and narrated by John Pruden. Marx assumes tacitly that the social condition of a class uniquely determines its interests, and that there can be no doubt what kind of policy best serves these interests. The class does not have to choose between various policies. The historical situation enjoins upon it a definite policy. There is no alternative. It follows that the class does not act, since acting implies choosing among various possible ways of procedure. The material productive forces act through the medium of the class members. But Marx, Engels, and all other Marxians ignored this fundamental dogma of their creed as soon as they stepped beyond the borders of epistemology and began commenting upon historical and political issues. Then, they not only charged the non-proletarian classes with hostility to the proletarians, but criticized their policies as not conducive to promoting the true interests of their own classes. The most important of Marx's political pamphlets is the Address on the Civil War in France, 1871. It furiously attacks the French government which, backed by the immense majority of the nation, was intent upon quelling the rebellion of the Paris Commune. It recklessly calumniates all the leading members of that government, calling them swindlers, forgers, and embezzlers. Jules Favre, it charges, was living in concubinage with the wife of a dipsomaniac, and General de Galifet profited from the alleged prostitution of his wife. In short, the pamphlet set the pattern for the defamation tactics of the socialist press, which the Marxians indignantly chastised as one of the worst excrescences of capitalism when the tabloid press adopted it. Yet all these slanderous lies, however reprehensible, may be interpreted as partisan stratagems in the implacable war against bourgeois civilization. They are at least not incompatible with Marxian epistemological principles. But it is another thing to question the expediency of the bourgeois policy from the standpoint of the class interests of the bourgeoisie. The Address maintains that the policy of the French bourgeoisie has unmasked the essential teachings of its own ideology, the only purpose of which is to delay the class struggle. Henceforth, it will no longer be possible for the class rule of the bourgeoisie to hide in a nationalist uniform. Henceforth, there will no longer be any question of peace or armistice between the workers and their exploiters. The battle will be resumed again and again, and there can be no doubt about the final victory of the working men. It must be noted that these observations were made with regard to a situation in which the majority of the French people had only to choose between unconditional surrender to a small minority of revolutionaries or fighting them. Neither Marx nor anybody else had ever expected that the majority of a nation would yield without resistance to armed aggression on the part of a minority. Still more important is the fact that Marx, in these observations, ascribes to the policies adopted by the French bourgeoisie a decisive influence upon the course of events. In this, he contradicts all his other writings. In the Communist Manifesto, he had announced the implacable and relentless class struggle without any regard to the defense tactics the bourgeois may resort to. He had deduced the inevitability of this struggle from the class situation of the exploiters and that of the exploited. There is no room in the Marxian system for the assumption that the policies adopted by the bourgeoisie could in any way affect the emergence of the class struggle and its outcome. If it is true that one class, the French bourgeoisie of 1871, was in a position to choose between alternative policies and through its decision to influence the course of events, the same must be true also of other classes in other historical situations. Then, all the dogmas of Marxian materialism are exploded. Then it is not true that the class situation teaches a class what its genuine class interests are and what kind of policy best serves these interests. It is not true that only such ideas as are conducive to the real interests of a class meet with approval on the part of those who direct the policies of the class. It may happen that different ideas direct those policies and thus get an influence upon the course of events. But then it is not true that what counts in history are only interests, and that ideas are merely an ideological superstructure, uniquely determined by these interests. It becomes imperative to scrutinize ideas in order to sift those which are really beneficial to the interests of the class concerned from those which are not. It becomes necessary to discuss conflicting ideas with the methods of logical reasoning. The makeshift by means of which Marx wanted to outlaw such dispassionate weighing of the pros and cons of definite ideas breaks down. The way toward an examination of the merits and demerits of socialism, which Marx wanted to prohibit as unscientific, is reopened. Another important address of Marx was his paper of 1865, Value, Price, and Profit. In this document, Marx criticizes the traditional policies of the labor unions. They should abandon their conservative motto, a fair day's wages for a fair day's work, and ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. This is obviously a controversy about which kind of policy best serves the class interests of the workers. Marx, in this case, deviates from his usual procedure of branding all his proletarian opponents traitors. He implicitly admits that there can prevail dissent even among honest and sincere champions of the class interests of the workers, and that such differences must be settled by debating the issue. Perhaps, on second thought, he himself discovered that the way he had dealt with the problem involved was incompatible with all his dogmas, for he did not have printed this paper, which he had read on June 26, 1865, in the General Council of the International Workingmen's Association. It was first published in 1898 by one of his daughters. But the theme we are scrutinizing is not Marx's failure to cling consistently to his own doctrine and his lapses into ways of thinking incompatible with it. We have to examine the tenability of the Marxian doctrine and must therefore turn to the peculiar connotation the term interests has in the context of this doctrine. Every individual, and for that matter every group of individuals, aims in acting at the substitution of a state of affairs that suits him better for a state of affairs that he considers less satisfactory. Without any regard to the qualification of these two states of affairs from any other point of view, we may say in this sense that he pursues his own interests. But the question of what is more desirable and what is less is decided by the acting individual. It is the outcome of choosing among various possible solutions. It is a judgment of value. It is determined by the individual's ideas about the effects these various states may have upon his own well-being. But it ultimately depends upon the value he attaches to these anticipated effects. If we keep this in mind, it is not sensible to declare that ideas are a product of interests. Ideas tell a man what his interests are. At a later date, looking upon his past actions, the individual may form the opinion that he has erred, and that another mode of acting would have served his own interests better. But this does not mean that at the critical instant in which he acted, he did not act according to his interests. He acted according to what he, at that time, considered would serve his interests best. If an unaffected observer looks upon another man's action, he may think, "This fellow errs. What he does will not serve what he considers to be his interest. Another way of acting would be more suitable for attaining the ends he aims at." In this sense, a historian can say today, or a judicious contemporary could say in 1939, in invading Poland, Hitler and the Nazis made a mistake. The invasion harmed what they considered to be their interests. Such criticism is sensible so long as it deals only with the means and not with the ultimate ends of an action. The choice of ultimate ends is a judgment of value solely dependent on the judging individual's valuation. All that another man can say about it is, "I would have made a different choice." If a Roman had said to a Christian doomed to be lacerated by wild beasts in the circus, "You will best serve your interests by bowing down and worshiping the statue of our divine emperor," the Christian would have answered, "My prime interest is to comply with the precepts of my creed." But Marxism, as a philosophy of history claiming to know the ends which men are bound to aim at, employs the term interests with a different connotation. The interests it refers to are not those chosen by men on the ground of judgments of value. They are the ends the material productive forces are aiming at. These forces aim at the establishment of socialism. They use the proletarians as a means for the realization of this end. The superhuman material productive forces pursue their own interests independently of the will of mortal men. The proletarian class is merely a tool in their hands. The actions of the class are not its own actions, but those which the material productive forces perform in using the class as an instrument without a will of its own. The class interests to which Marx refers are in fact the interests of the material productive forces which want to be freed from the fetters upon their development. Interests of this kind, of course, do not depend upon the ideas of ordinary men. They are determined exclusively by the ideas of the man Marx, who generated both the phantom of the material productive forces and the anthropomorphic image of their interests. In the world of reality, life, and human action, there is no such thing as interests independent of ideas preceding them temporally and logically. What a man considers his interest is the result of his ideas. If there is any sense in the proposition that the interests of the proletarians would be best served by socialism, it is this. The ends which the individual proletarians are aiming at will be best achieved by socialism. Such a proposition requires proof. It is vain to substitute for such a proof the recourse to an arbitrarily contrived system of philosophy, of history. All this could never occur to Marx because he was engrossed by the idea that human interests are uniquely and entirely determined by the biological nature of the human body. Man, as he saw it, is exclusively interested in the procurement of the largest quantity of tangible goods. There is no qualitative, only a quantitative problem in the supply of goods and services. Wants do not depend on ideas, but solely on physiological conditions. Blinded by this preconception, Marx ignored the fact that one of the problems of production is to decide what kind of goods are to be produced. With animals and with primitive men on the verge of starvation, it is certainly true that nothing counts but the quantity of edible things they can secure. There is no need to point out that conditions are entirely different for men, even for those in the earliest stages of civilization. Civilized man is faced with the problem of choosing among the satisfactions of various needs and among various modes of satisfying the same need. His interests are diversified and are determined by the ideas that influence his choosing. One does not serve the interests of a man who wants a new coat by giving him a pair of shoes, or those of a man who wants to hear a Beethoven symphony by giving him admission to a boxing match. It is ideas that are responsible for the fact that the interests of people are disparate. Incidentally, it may be mentioned that this misconstruing of human wants and interests prevented Marx and other socialists from comprehending the distinction between freedom and slavery, between the condition of a man who himself decides how to spend his income and that of a man whom a paternal authority supplies with those things which, as the authority thinks, he needs. In the market economy, the consumers choose and thereby determine the quantity and the quality of the goods produced. Under socialism, the authority takes care of these matters. In the eyes of Marx and the Marxians, there is no substantial difference between these two methods of want satisfaction. It is of no consequence who chooses, the paltry individual for himself, or the authority for all its subjects. They fail to realize that the authority does not give its wards what they want to get, but what, according to the opinion of the authority, they ought to get. If a man who wants to get the Bible gets the Koran instead, he is no longer free. But even if for the sake of argument we were to admit that there is uncertainty neither concerning the kind of goods people are asking for, nor concerning the most expedient technological methods of producing them, there remains the conflict between interests in the short run and those in the long run. Here again, the decision depends on ideas. It is judgments of value that determine the amount of time preference attached to the value of present goods as against that of future goods. Should one consume or accumulate capital? And how far should capital depletion or accumulation go? Instead of dealing with all these problems, Marx contented himself with the dogma that socialism will be an earthly paradise in which everybody will get all he needs. Of course, if one starts from this dogma, one can quietly declare that the interests of everybody, whatever they may be, will be best served under socialism. In the land of Cocaine, people will no longer need any ideas, will no longer have to resort to any judgments of value, will no longer think and act. They will only open their mouths to let the roast pigeons fly in. In the world of reality, the conditions of which are the only object of the scientific search for truth, ideas determine what people consider to be their interests. There is no such thing as interests that could be independent of ideas. It is ideas that determine what people consider as their interests. Free men do not act in accordance with their interests. They act in accordance with what they believe furthers their interests. The Ludwig von Mises Institute hopes you have enjoyed this audio Mises Daily. For a world of free market literature, media, and discussion, visit Mises.org.